The royal family thought they had drawn a line. They thought the separation was clean enough, the distances wide enough, the institutional arrangements sufficiently formalized that the Andrew and Sarah situation could be described as contained. He at Marsh Farm in Norfolk, she somewhere in Europe or the Middle East, or with friends across a network that has proved, across months of her disappearance from public view, to be considerably more extensive than most people realized. Two people, two separate locations. Two separate crises being managed along separate institutional tracks. That was the arrangement. That was what the palace was presenting, and then came the sightings. A source familiar with the situation described running into both Sarah Ferguson and Andrew Mountbatten Windsor together at an M6 motorway service station a few weeks ago. Not at a formal event or a family gathering or any of the occasions where their continued connection to each other and to the family would be expected and managed. A petrol station on a motorway in the English Midlands, together. In circumstances that suggested she was rather more present in Britain and rather more in his orbit than the geography of her reported disappearance had implied. The source put it directly: she had been assumed to be in hiding but was apparently operating in somewhat plain sight. Which raises the obvious question about where exactly the line is between the retreat that the institution requires and the reality of two people whose lives have been entangled for more than 4 decades and who have not apparently found the instruction to disentangle them as straightforward as those issuing the instruction may have assumed. The rumors about how exactly that continued proximity is being maintained have been extensive and have varied considerably in their plausibility. Some claims circulating in the more sensationalized corners of the coverage have described elaborate scenarios involving Sarah being transporting inside moving vehicles, crouching out of sight to avoid security checkpoints, engaging in what one account described as something resembling a Cold War-style covert operation to breach the perimeter of the Sandringham estate. These accounts should be treated with considerable skepticism. They have the quality of tabloid embellishment rather than credible intelligence, and the specific operational details they describe, hiding in footwells, being ferried in furniture trucks, sound considerably more dramatic than anything that the available evidence actually supports. What the evidence does support is the simpler and in some ways more revealing reality that two people who have known each other for 40 years, who raised children together, who shared a home for nearly 2 decades after their divorce, and who are now both navigating serious and overlapping crises without any obvious alternative source of the specific kind of support they provide each other, those two people have been continuing to maintain contact. And that contact appears to have continued despite the institutional preference for a cleaner separation, not because they are engaged in some grand conspiracy of concealment, but because the human reality of their connection is proving more persistent than the institutional preference for distance can entirely accommodate. The nature of that connection and why it has survived everything that should by conventional logic have severed it is worth examining seriously rather than simply noting as a curiosity, because the bond between Andrew and Sarah is not simply the residue of old affection, however real that affection is and has been. It is something more structurally specific. A royal biographer who has studied the York family in detail has described the relationship with a precision that cuts through the more romantic framings. Her continued proximity to Andrew at Royal Lodge served her commercially because it kept her inside the family circle in ways that were useful for her business dealings. It provided continued access and continued association with the royal world at a time when her formal connection to it had been severed by the divorce. His name and the estate opened doors that her name alone, increasingly complicated by scandal, had become less reliable at opening. She needed that proximity. He needed her presence, the specific kind of daily companionship and domestic normality that her continued existence in his household provided in a world where almost everything else was contracting around him. They had separate wings. They had their own lives, their own social worlds, their own private relationships across the period. The nannies and the security staff did much of the actual parenting while he traveled, and she spent extended periods in America building the commercial relationships that kept them financially afloat. The reality of the cohabitation was considerably less cozy than the happily divorced couple framing implied. But the arrangement persisted because it served both of them in ways that the alternatives did not, and because the specific form of loyalty that had developed between them, not romantic loyalty in the conventional sense, but something more practical and more durable, the loyalty of two people who have faced a series of catastrophes together and have learned that the other person will not disappear when things become difficult, proved resilient enough to survive the end of the formal marriage and the various subsequent disasters. Now, in 2026, both of them are facing the most acute and most serious version of the catastrophes that have defined the arc of their public lives. Andrew is in Marsh Farm, under criminal investigation, with the specific allegation about passing confidential government information to Epstein sitting in the background of everything else that has accumulated against his name. Sarah is moving between wealthy friends across multiple countries, appearing occasionally in Britain, navigating questions about her own Epstein connections, managing the fallout from the dissolved businesses and the closed charity, and the congressional request for testimony that has received no public response. Both of them are, in the most concrete and practical sense, more isolated from their usual sources of support and institutional protection than at any previous point in their lives. And into that mutual isolation, the sightings of them together at a motorway service station in the English Midlands makes a very specific kind of sense. Not as a covert operations, not as a conspiracy of concealment. As two people whose lives have been entangled for 40 years reaching for each other in the specific way that people reach for the person who has known them longest and who has survived the most with them when everything else becomes impossible to navigate alone. Sources close to observers of the situation have described a dimension of the relationship that goes beyond emotional support and into something that carries more institutional weight. The claim, circulating in various forms in the coverage, is that both Andrew and Sarah understand that they know things about the shared history of their lives, their associations, their finances, and their relationship with the palace over decades that neither of them has made fully public. The Epstein emails alone, the ones that have been released and analyzed extensively, represent only a portion of the documented communication that existed between them and the figures at the center of the scandal. What remains sealed, what the full documentary record of their lives contains, is not fully known outside the investigators who are examining it. This creates the specific dynamic that a royal biographer described with notable directness: she could be dangerous to them. If pushed far enough, if the financial desperation becomes acute enough, or if the institutional abandonment feels complete enough, there is material available to her, stories about the family, about relationships, about the internal reality of life adjacent to the monarchy across the years when she was part of it, that could be deployed in ways that would create considerable difficulty for the institution. Whether she would ever actually deploy it is a different question. But the possibility that she might is part of what makes the management of her situation from the palace's perspective so delicate. You do not want to push someone with that much first-hand knowledge of your most sensitive history into a corner from which the only exit looks like going public with everything they know. The pattern of her movements since the Epstein files were released in January 2026 is itself a kind of communication. Switzerland, possibly Ireland, Scotland, the Middle East, wealthy friends across multiple countries. The Paracelsus Recovery Clinic in Zurich, with its price point that has prompted sustained questions about who is funding the current lifestyle given the collapsed commercial empire. The deliberate avoidance of the United States, where the congressional request for testimony sits unanswered, and where the anger around the Epstein story among the public and among investigators is most intense. Each element of the pattern tells you something about how she is assessing her situation and what she is trying to achieve by the specific geography of her disappearance. She is staying available in Britain. She is staying reachable apparently to Andrew. She is not cutting contact or creating the kind of permanent geographic separation that would signal a genuine and final severance of the connection. Whether that continued availability is driven primarily by the emotional reality of a 40-year bond that neither of them has found a way to end, or by the more strategic consideration that remaining in each other's orbit preserves a form of mutual protection that full separation would remove, the answer is probably some of both, and the proportions are not something that either of them could fully disentangle even if asked directly. William's response to the evidence that the separation is not as clean as the institution requires has been, by all accounts, one of intensifying frustration rather than surprise. He has watched the Andrew situation develop for years with a clarity that is sharpened by the knowledge that the institution he will inherit is the one that has to answer for it. His position, as reported by people close to his thinking, is that the continued proximity of Andrew and Sarah to each other and to the Sandringham estate represents an ongoing risk that the institutional management of the situation has not been sufficient to address. The rumors that have circulated about Sarah being transporting into Sandringham in ways designed to avoid detection, whatever the actual accuracy of those specific claims, speak to a broader pattern that William finds institutionally unacceptable. Two people who are supposed to be in managed retreat, who the institution has invested considerable effort in positioning as separate from the working monarchy's daily life, apparently continuing to operate in ways that periodically require the institution to respond to their continued presence in its geography. For William, this is not primarily a personal grievance. He is not primarily exercised about the specific mechanics of how Sarah gets onto or off the Sandringham estate. He is exercised about what the pattern represents and what it signals about the degree to which the institutional decisions that have been made about the York situation are actually being respected by the people those decisions were made about. If Andrew and Sarah continue to operate according to their own logic, the logic of two people who have always found ways to maintain proximity regardless of the institutional preference for distance, then the narrative of the York chapter being closed and the institution moving on is a narrative that keeps being contradicted by reality. Kate's position in all of this is reported to be equally firm, though coming from a slightly different angle. The concern attributed to her is generational rather than purely institutional. The pattern of secrecy and the habit of operating around the edges of the formal rules rather than within them is the specific quality that, in her assessment, risks becoming the frame through which the York family is understood when history eventually writes the chapter. For the children she is raising, the ones who will eventually carry the weight of the crown in a form that has been shaped by everything happening now, the presence of an ongoing York situation that refuses to resolve cleanly is a complication that compounds with time rather than diminishing. Prince Edward's reported role as a messenger sent to convey to Andrew at Wood Farm that his days in that property were finished and that the king's tolerance had reached its limit fits the pattern of how the family handles its most difficult internal communications. Not through official channels or formal letters or anything that would create a public record of the conversation. Through a personal emissary. A sibling who can convey the message in terms that carry the weight of family rather than just institution, who can communicate the seriousness of the situation without it becoming a public confrontation that the institution then has to manage as its own story. Edward is the right person for that kind of message precisely because he is not Charles and he is not William. He is the sibling who is close enough to the principals to be heard and far enough from the center of the institutional decision-making to function as a human messenger rather than a royal emissary. The question that sits under all of the specific details of where Sarah has been and how the covert sightings are being interpreted, and what William's position on the ongoing proximity is the larger question about what the Andrew and Sarah situation ultimately represents for the institution. There are two ways to read it. The first reading is that two deeply compromised people who have always operated according to their own logic rather than the institution's preferred framework are simply continuing to do what they have always done, and that the institution's frustration with them is the entirely predictable consequence of having managed a situation through accommodation rather than resolution for too long. The second reading is that the bond between them is itself a form of institutional information, that two people who know this much about this family's most sensitive history, who have this level of access to the documented and undocumented reality of decades of royal life, maintaining close contact in the middle of multiple overlapping investigations, is a situation that carries risks that go beyond the ordinary reputational damage of a royal scandal. Both readings have merit. And the tension between them, the tension between the human reality of two people who cannot entirely separate themselves from a 40-year connection, and the institutional reality of a monarchy trying to close a chapter that the principals refuse to close, is the specific form that the Andrew and Sarah situation has taken in 2026. They were spotted at an M6 service station together a few weeks ago. The royal family had drawn a line in the sand. The line keeps getting redrawn around where they actually are rather than where the institution would prefer them to be. That is not a covert operation. It is not a Cold War thriller. It is two people who have been through everything together continuing to reach for each other in the specific way that 40 years of shared history, shared catastrophes, shared children, and shared secrets produces in two people who have no one else who fully understands what they are navigating. Whether that specific form of mutual support is something the institution can eventually accommodate in some form, or whether it represents an ongoing liability that the monarchy will have to keep managing around rather than resolving, is the question that the M6 sighting answers in the most concrete way available. They are still there. Still together at least sometimes, at least occasionally. Still sharing whatever version of the 40-year bond has survived everything that has been thrown at it. Still, in some fundamental sense, refusing to be fully separated by decisions that were made about them rather than with them. The palace is managing. The institution is drawing its lines. William is hardening his position. And somewhere on the M6 or in a farmhouse in Norfolk or in a friend's house in Britain where she is apparently staying at the moment, Andrew and Sarah are living the specific reality that the institutional management of their situation has not yet fully succeeded in containing. The chapter is not closed. The story is not over. And the people who thought drawing a line in the sand would be sufficient have apparently discovered that sand is less permanent than they hoped.